Before starting, I just wanted to let you know that the Tragedies of Gorboduc was first performed at the Christmas celebration in Inner Temple in 1561 and also performed at Whitehall before Queen Elizabeth. So let me start with reading the argument of the tragedy. We can see right before the scene one starts, as I think it's going to help you to remind what happened in Gorboduc. Gorboduc, king of Britain, divided his realm in his lifetime to his sons, Ferrex and Porrex. The sons fell to division and dissension. The younger killed the elder. The mother that more dearly loved the elder, for revenge killed the younger. The people, moved with the cruelty of the fact, rose in rebellion and slew both father and mother. The nobility assembled and most terribly destroyed the rebels, and afterwards, for want of issue of the prince, whereby the succession of the crown became uncertain, they fell to severe war in which both they and many of their issues were slain, and the land for a long time almost desolate and miserably wasted. The argument of the tragedy compactly tells every discussable point of the play Gorboduc. My presentation will more casually deal with the issues from generally discussed, plus my personal point of view. As you might all figure out, Gorboduc is based on Geoffrey of Monmouth, Historia Legum Britanniae, that pictured the tragedy of Gorboduc Kingdom. And it is known that the writers of Thomas Norton and Thomas Sackville used this order plot device to give a political message to unmarried Queen Elizabeth, which was to push her to decide the heir who was not in presence. The disturbance in the final scene where Gorboduc and Vidana were slain and the territory undergoes a severe war without proper monarch is exactly depicting the expected confusion and turmoil after Elizabeth's reign is over. This background information is quite simple and seems to be uncontentious among scholars. So I'd rather focus on the works picturing the transitional phase of the sovereignty's absolute power through the request of participation of parliament. And with complexity, the play Gorboduc shows a political spectrum from absolutism to parliamentarism and republicanism, exposing the traits and defects of each simultaneously, and also the basic political tension arising between people, group, and community. Then the last question we could think about arrives at what kind of politics Norton and Sackville's Gorboduc can or intend to argue for the best. As we can see in the argument, the tragedy starts from the division from 1 to 2. I bet many, including you, have your own thoughts about whether 1 is better than 2 when it comes to dealing and comparing it with the honor of power, to which I personally think if the quality of that 1 is indeed better, that is superior to 2 participants in terms of unity, decisiveness, and stableness. And this question will help you to decide to which you stand closer, from absolutism to non-absolutism, conservatism to non-conservatism. It is interesting that the tragedy of Gorboduc starts from the good king's seemingly untimely modesty to hand over his kingdom to his sons. For generally, the foreseen hamartia to rulers is arrogance and exceeding pride. This king's decision is at the center of the political debate. The king talks about his plan to divide the sovereignty to the councillors, and against the councillors' advice on timing and rationality, he propels his plan into action. And tragedy begins. Here, 2 separate facts can be attributed for the tragedy depending on your and our political perspective. One would say his tyrannical action turning a deaf ear to councillors' advices and making the dogmatic decision or brought about the undesirable destruction. But I think others might say his decision to give up the sole power and divide it into the 2 caused it all. The reason why I thought Gorboduc was quite intriguing was for this point. The interpretations for and against absolutism are both accessible and open within the plot. And the failure of tyranny can convey 2 opposite historical contexts. The tyranny failed in sustaining power, and the failure of nation from tyranny's abusing power. Majumdar says in the paper that early Tudor morality plays are always concerned with the legitimate monarch who degenerates into tyrant, while later Tudor historical and tragic drama foregrounds the illegitimate usurper who is tyrant by definition. Regarding the play partially and critically exposed the tragic failure of tyranny from being the law by himself, a perspective that holds in check the divine right of the king, the absolute sovereignty secured by the god probably began to rise. This then, in a way, can be radically read, and it seems to reflect the history of England. Queen Elizabeth's absolutism was helped by the fundamental support from both feudal lords and growthy bourgeois, as she stood for both sides' interests. But the growing power of the latter reached a certain level of obstacles and threats to the sovereignty in later period. A social context of which I suppose why Gorbachev can stand ambiguously between support for and doubt on absolutism. Stepping further, this is the reason why I believe the superficial intent is only but to persuade the queen to make sure the successor to the absolutism, but another side that implicates no less colorful political context. Can you also feel that the play also discusses the proper intervention and stronger practice of parliament power for the monarch's insightful ruling? King Gorbachev, not following the tradition, custom, the rules, and law, divides the territory and hands it over to the sons. His decision itself is the law. The queen's favoritism to the order some matters, but the king's decision actively puts those family members' trust on the cutting board first, with disobeying the convention and rules of primogeniture. His decision caused the Ferrex doubts of his brother, the fear of Peric's physical emotional division, family murder, and disturbance. Also, when he retook the judging authority after Peric's crime, the law is not referred to, though it existed, and the king waits to make his own decision. And I think the lack of proper legal remedy and punishment gave Vidana, the queen, a leeway on arbitrary revenge, which was to kill his second son, Perix. Thus, the absolutism is portrayed to be the beginning to the tragic plot as a whole. But as I mentioned earlier, absolutism is never directly questioned. Yes, of course, this was Elizabethan era, the representative successful absolutism period. So I think it is better to have it as a textual evidence to conjecture the power tensions among monarch, parliament, nobility, bourgeois in constant negotiation to sustain their interest. This is really my personal thought, but I thought the king Gorbachev's splitting the power was his political intention to sustain the validity of his power through young bodies against his frailty and surrounding environments, including counselors. The stance of the best secretary Eubulus, the people's rebellion, and the crime of slaying the king and queen, and the son's counselors working as mischief makers effectively speak for the need of strong absolutism. It shows how a split power consecutively brings about disorder and disturbance in community. Historically, parliamentarism in every continent was working as a beginning of development to constitutionalism, republicanism, and democracy. If counselors in the play symbolize the parliament, the play partially supports their smart working, but at the same time discloses their probable flattering anti-justice actions for own interest, the defects and limitation of their politics. Also, the status of parliamentarism always brings complex meaning as the majority rule. The critical characteristic of republicanism and democracy starts and is adopted in itself. Parliament is the place where the people in rebellion dreams of and aims at, or ideologically practice the levy against the king. That explains how and why the plot of the play introduces parliamentarism, but at the same time forewarn rebellion, as it follows chronically. And Eubulus effectively expresses this aspect, I thought. He, the smartest secretary in the final scene, still believes in the divine right, supporting its legitimacy more than any other councilor members. Gorbachev, the sole power, was a good king, and the position was designated and guaranteed by God. And the Sackable's aristocratic view seems to have effectively expressed borrowing Eubulus' voice, maintaining his ground for absolutism like the stance of loyalists in parliament. I think the play Gorvoda implicates a lot in political context. This can depict a historical picture of constitutional monarch, which was established later, and also the text still can give a hint to modern political structure of presidential system and parliamentary government in its way of finding and resolving tension. I hope you enjoyed reading this play as much as I did, and want to listen to your thoughts too. So, thank you for listening.